the state health department arrived at Peaceful Valley Care Center on a Thursday morning with emergency suspension orders. The facility director's hands trembled as she read the citations. By Friday, the medical director had surrendered his license. By Monday, 3 residents had been transferred to actual hospitals for treatment of conditions that should have been addressed weeks earlier. By the end of the month, criminal charges were filed for negligent homicide, and every family with a deceased relative was being contacted for wrongful death investigations. Everyone eventually learned the name Frank Sullivan, not as the quiet man in room 14 with the oxygen tank, but as the retired Boston Fire Department paramedic who had spent 34 years responding to emergencies and had just documented the most systematic case of medical neglect in Pennsylvania history. It all started with 14 words he wasn't supposed to hear. Mr. Sullivan's blood pressure is dropping fast, but wait 30 minutes before calling. His son works at Memorial Hospital, and corporate doesn't want another expensive transfer on the books this quarter. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. Frank Sullivan woke at 5:47 a.m. on a Wednesday in November, his body remembering the shift schedules he'd kept for 34 years, even though he'd been retired for 3. The room was cold. They kept the heat low until 7 a.m., cost-saving measure, and he could hear his own breathing, the slight wheeze that came with COPD, the legacy of too many years running into burning buildings before anyone understood how much smoke damage accumulated in lungs. He sat up slowly, reached for the oxygen concentrator beside his bed, fitted the cannula into his nose. 2 liters per minute, constant flow. Not terrible, not great. Enough to keep him functional if he moved carefully, paced himself, didn't push his limits the way he used to when he was young and stupid, and thought his body was indestructible. The room smelled like industrial cleaning solution and the faint staleness that came from inadequate ventilation. Peaceful Valley Care Center was not peaceful and sat in no valley. It was a squat 2-story building on a flat stretch of rural Pennsylvania farmland, 40 minutes from the nearest real hospital, surrounded by nothing but fields and the occasional gas station. Frank's room was small, institutional, gray walls, thin carpet, narrow bed, small dresser, bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. On the dresser sat a photograph of Kate, his wife, taken at their daughter Beth's wedding in 2015. Kate had died in 2022, pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal. Next to the photo sat his firefighter's helmet, the dress helmet from his retirement ceremony, polished and preserved. Boston Fire Department, ladder 15, 34 years of service. He'd been a good firefighter, had made lieutenant, could have pushed for captain, but preferred working with his crew over managing paperwork. He'd been an even better paramedic, got his EMT certification in the 80s, became a paramedic in the 90s, spent the last 15 years of his career running emergency medical calls. He'd saved lives, lost some too, but saved more than he'd lost. It was what kept him going after Kate died, the knowledge that he'd made a difference, that people were alive because of his training and his quick thinking and his willingness to run toward danger. His son Michael had convinced him to move to Peaceful Valley 18 months ago. "Dad, you can't live alone with COPD. What if something happens? You need professional care, people who can monitor you." Michael worked in healthcare administration at Memorial Hospital, 40 minutes away. He'd researched facilities, found Peaceful Valley, arranged everything. It's affordable on your pension and Social Security. They specialize in respiratory patients. You'll be safe there. Frank had believed him. Michael was his only son, successful, worked in healthcare, seemed to know what he was talking about. And Frank had been tired of managing the house alone, tired of worrying about his breathing, tired of the empty rooms that still smelled like Kate's perfume. Peaceful Valley was not what Michael had promised. The specialized respiratory care meant oxygen concentrators in every room and a single respiratory therapist who came twice a week for 15 minutes per patient. The professional monitoring meant aides checking on residents every 4 hours unless they were too busy, which they usually were. The food was institutional and tasteless. The activities were bingo and old movies, and the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away on rural roads. But Frank had adapted, same as he'd adapted to every firehouse transfer, every shift change, every new captain who thought they knew better. You made the best of what you had. You found your routine. You survived. The breakfast cart arrived at 7:15 a.m. Denise brought his tray, oatmeal, toast, coffee that tasted like it had been made hours ago, reheated, his morning medications in a paper cup, bronchodilator, blood pressure pill, baby aspirin. "Morning, Frank," Denise said. She was one of the few staff who didn't call him Mr. Sullivan. He'd told her to use his first name, preferred it. Made him feel less like a patient, more like a person. "Morning, Denise. How's your daughter doing?" He remembered everyone's personal details, another firefighter habit. Know your crew, know their families, build the relationships that might save lives someday. "Good, thanks for asking. Second grade's going well." She smiled, genuine warmth, then hurried to the next room. Always hurrying, always behind schedule. Peaceful Valley was chronically understaffed. He'd figured out the patterns within his first month. They ran with minimal nursing staff, relied heavily on aides, cut every corner possible to maximize corporate profits. Frank ate his breakfast, took his medications, spent the morning reading the newspaper someone had left in the common room. He still followed Boston news online when he could get to the facility's single shared computer, still checked in with his old crew through Facebook, still maintained connections to the life he'd lived before COPD and widowhood and Michael's well-meaning intervention. At 11:23 a.m., Frank heard a sound he recognized instantly, the gasping, desperate breathing of someone in respiratory distress. Room 12, 2 doors down. Mrs. Chen, 84, emphysema, usually stable, but sometimes had acute episodes. Frank moved into the hallway, saw Mrs. Chen's door open, heard the gasping more clearly. He knocked, entered. Mrs. Chen sat on her bed, lips blue, chest heaving, eyes wide with panic. Classic signs of acute respiratory failure. Frank pressed the call button, hard. "I need a nurse in room 12 immediately. Patient in respiratory distress." He moved to Mrs. Chen, checked her oxygen, disconnected somehow, tubing pulled loose from the concentrator. He reconnected it, increased the flow to 4 liters, positioned her upright to help breathing. "Mrs. Chen, look at me. You're okay. Breathe with me. Slow breaths. In through your nose, out through your mouth." It was automatic, the training of 34 years. Assess the situation, stabilize the patient, get help coming. He'd done it 1,000 times on street corners and in burning buildings and in ambulances racing to the hospital. Jennifer, one of the LPNs, arrived 3 minutes later. "What's going on?" "Acute respiratory distress," Frank said. "Oxygen was disconnected. She's stabilized now, but needs evaluation. You should call her doctor, possibly 911. Jennifer checked Mrs. Chen's pulse, listened to her breathing. "She seems okay now. I'll note it in her chart and monitor her. She was blue when I got here," Frank said. "That's severe hypoxia. She needs medical evaluation. Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your concern, but we have protocols. I'll handle this." She left. Mrs. Chen's breathing had improved with the increased oxygen, but Frank had seen enough respiratory cases to know this wasn't over. She needed intervention, possibly antibiotics if it was an infection, possibly steroids if it was COPD exacerbation, possibly hospitalization if she couldn't maintain stable oxygen levels. He stayed with her for 20 minutes until her breathing normalized completely, then returned to his room, troubled. Jennifer hadn't called anyone, hadn't taken vitals beyond pulse, hadn't followed up appropriately. Over the next 2 weeks, Frank noticed a pattern. Residents had acute medical issues, falls, chest pain, severe confusion, breathing problems, and staff response was minimal. They'd assess, noted in charts, but rarely called doctors and almost never called 911. He watched Mr. Washington have what looked like a stroke, facial droop, slurred speech, one-sided weakness, and staff did nothing, except monitor him until his symptoms spontaneously improved hours later. Classic TIA, should have gone to emergency immediately for stroke protocol. He watched Miss Davis fall in the common room, hit her head hard enough to bleed, and staff cleaned the wound and put a bandage on it without calling anyone. No concussion check, no imaging, no medical follow-up. He watched Mr. Rodriguez develop what was clearly pneumonia, fever, productive cough, confusion, and staff gave him Tylenol and increased fluids, but didn't call his doctor for antibiotics until he'd been sick for 4 days. Frank had spent 34 years as a first responder. He knew when someone needed emergency medical intervention, and he was watching residents who needed hospitals being kept in the facility with minimal care. On a Thursday afternoon in late November, Frank was walking past the nursing station when he heard voices from the medication room. The door was partially open. Two voices, Jennifer the LPN and someone else, male, probably Marcus the facility's administrator. Frank slowed, leaned against the wall as if resting. Old habit from his firefighting days. You learn to listen for information that might save lives. Sullivan's blood pressure is dropping fast, Jennifer was saying. Her voice sounded stressed, uncertain. Systolic's down to 88. He's confused, clammy. He needs... Wait 30 minutes before calling. Marcus's voice, flat and certain. His son works at Memorial Hospital, and corporate doesn't want another expensive transfer on the books this quarter. We're already over budget on ambulance calls. But if he's having a cardiac event, then we'll call in 30 minutes when we're sure it's serious. Might stabilize on its own. Most of them do. Most of them don't, Jennifer said, but her voice was weaker now, accepting. Just monitor him closely. If he crashes, obviously we call. But give it time first. Hospital transfers kill our profit margins, and your performance review is coming up. We need team players who understand the financial realities. Frank stood very still, every nerve in his body screaming alert. They were delaying emergency response, deliberately, for cost reasons. And they'd specifically mentioned his son, Michael, who worked at Memorial Hospital. Implied some kind of connection, some reason to avoid sending patients there. He returned to his room, sat on his bed, and processed what he'd just heard with the cold tactical thinking of 3 decades of emergency response. They were letting people die to save money, or at least letting them suffer through treatable conditions, delaying intervention until situations became so critical they had no choice. And corporate policy apparently supported this. They were tracking ambulance costs, considering them over budget, making medical decisions based on financial margins instead of patient need. Frank thought about Mrs. Chen's respiratory crisis, Mr. Washington's stroke symptoms, Miss Davis's head, injury, Mr. Rodriguez's pneumonia. All of them had needed immediate medical evaluation. None of them had received it. How many others? How many residents had died or suffered permanent damage because Peaceful Valley delayed calling 911 until it was too late? And Michael knew. Marcus had mentioned Michael specifically. His son works at Memorial Hospital. That wasn't random. Michael had placed Frank here, had arranged everything. Had he known about the facility's practices? Was he somehow involved? Frank felt sick. His own son. The boy he'd raised, taught right from wrong, shown what it meant to help people. Had that boy grown into a man who'd put his father in a facility that let people die for profit? He needed more information, needed to understand the scope, the pattern, the connections, needed evidence that would hold up when he reported this. And he would report it. There was no question about that. He'd spent his career saving lives. He wasn't going to sit quietly while people died around him. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. His COPD made lying flat difficult, and his mind wouldn't stop cataloging what he knew, what he suspected, what he needed to prove. At 2:17 a.m., he heard the overhead announcement, medical emergency, room 19. He got up, pulled on his robe, moved into the hallway. Room 19 was Mr. Thompson, 73, diabetic with heart disease. Frank watched from his doorway as Jennifer and another nurse entered the room. He heard fragments. Unresponsive, pulse weak, sugars 40, severe hypoglycemia. Mr. Thompson needed glucose immediately, needed ambulance, needed hospital. Frank waited for Jennifer to call 911. She didn't. She gave oral glucose, started IV fluids, things she could do without transferring him. 20 minutes passed. Mr. Thompson remained barely responsive, vitals unstable. Still no ambulance call. Finally, at 2:43 a.m., Jennifer called 911. Frank heard her on the phone. 74-year-old male, diabetic emergency, possible hypoglycemic event. She downplayed the severity, made it sound less urgent than it was. The ambulance arrived at 3:08 a.m., 25 minutes, reasonable for rural response. They took Mr. Thompson, lights and sirens. Frank heard Jennifer on the phone afterward, reporting to Marcus. Had to call on Thompson, couldn't wait any longer, he was coding. Coding meant dying. They had waited until Mr. Thompson was actively dying before calling for help. Frank returned to his room, sat on his bed with shaking hands. Not from age or illness, from rage barely contained. He'd spent 34 years running toward emergencies, doing everything possible to save lives. These people were running away from emergencies, doing as little as possible to avoid costs. The next morning, Frank called Michael from the facility phone in his room. "Son, I need to talk to you about something." "Dad, hi, what's up?" Michael's voice was distracted, busy. "There was an emergency here last night. Mr. Thompson from room 19. Severe. Hypoglycemia. Staff waited almost half an hour before calling 911. Silence on the line. Then, "Dad, I'm sure the staff assessed the situation appropriately. I was a paramedic for 15 years, Michael. I know what severe hypoglycemia looks like. They waited until he was coding before calling. The facility has protocols. The facility has cost-cutting measures that prioritize budget over patient care." Frank kept his voice steady, professional, the tone he'd used giving situation reports. "I heard the administrator telling a nurse to delay calling 911 because they're over budget on ambulance transfers." Another pause, longer. "Dad, you're not a doctor. You don't understand the complex medical decisions. I understand when someone's dying and needs emergency intervention. That's what I did for 34 years. Look, Peaceful Valley operates on thin margins. They have to make tough choices sometimes. That's healthcare reality." Michael's voice had taken on a defensive edge. "It's still the best option for your needs and your budget." "Best option for who, Michael? Me or whoever's paying you to send patients there?" Silence. Heavy, damning silence. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm implying that you put me in a facility that lets people die to save money, and you did it knowing about their practices. I'm asking if that's true." "Dad, you're confused. The COPD affects your cognition sometimes. I think we need to have you evaluated." "I'm not confused." Frank's voice was harder now, the command voice from his lieutenant days. "I'm observant, and I'm not going to let you gaslight me into thinking what I've seen isn't real." He hung up, sat with the phone in his hand, processing the conversation. Michael hadn't denied the allegations. He'd deflected, threatened to have Frank declared incompetent, implied Frank was too impaired to understand what he was seeing. That meant Michael knew, had probably known all along, had put his father in this place despite knowing, or perhaps because of knowing, about their practices. Frank felt the weight of betrayal settle over him, heavy as the turnout gear he used to wear. But he'd learned in the fire service that personal feelings had to wait. Lives were at stake. He'd grieve his son's corruption later. Right now, he had work to do. Over the next week, Frank became a one-man intelligence operation. He watched, he listened, he documented. He couldn't write well. His hands shook too much from the COPD medications, but he could remember. 34 years of giving detailed incident reports had trained his memory for facts, times, names, symptoms, decisions. He watched Mrs. Davis develop signs of infection after her untreated head wound, fever, confusion, lethargy. Staff gave antibiotics but didn't send her for imaging. The infection spread to her bloodstream. She died 3 days later. Staff called it natural causes. She was 92. He watched Mr. Martinez have increasingly severe chest pain. Over 2 days, staff gave nitroglycerin, monitored him, but didn't call his cardiologist or send him to hospital until the 3rd day when he had a major heart attack. He survived barely, with significant heart damage that might have been preventable if they'd intervened earlier. He watched Miss Patterson fall twice in 1 week, clearly having balance issues that suggested neurological problems. Staff did incident reports, increased supervision, but never sent her for evaluation. She fell a 3rd time, broke her hip, required surgery. Might have been prevented if they'd investigated the underlying cause after the first fall. Frank documented it all mentally. Dates, times, residents, symptoms, staff responses, outcomes. He built the case the way he'd built incident reports for decades, with factual precision and attention to detail, but he needed to get this information out. The facility monitored phone calls. He'd learned that when Michael called the administrator within an hour of their conversation. The mail was probably monitored too. He had no computer access beyond the shared terminal in the common room, which logged everything. He needed an outside contact, someone he trusted, someone who could take his information and act on it. He thought of Tommy Chen, his old partner from Ladder 15. They'd worked together for 12 years, had stayed in touch after Frank retired. Tommy was still active, still plugged into the fire service network, still remembered how to run an operation. On a Saturday afternoon, Frank made his way to the shared computer during a particularly chaotic activity time when staff were distracted by a birthday party in the common room. He logged into email. The facility monitored it, but he didn't care anymore, and sent a message to Tommy. Need your help. Medical emergency situation at care facility. Can't explain by phone or email. Can you visit? Important. Frank, Tommy replied within an hour. On shift until Monday, but coming Tuesday. You okay? Frank wrote back, I'm fine, others aren't. See you Tuesday. Tommy arrived Tuesday afternoon, in civilian clothes, carrying a six-pack of the good beer. Neither of them could drink anymore, but kept as tradition. He'd brought his son, Kevin, a lawyer. They sat in the family visiting room, with the door closed. Frank laid out everything he'd observed, every delayed response, every resident who'd suffered or died, the overheard conversation about delaying his own emergency response, Michael's reaction when confronted. Tommy listened with the focused attention of a firefighter receiving mission briefing. Kevin took notes, asked sharp questions, made phone calls. This is criminal negligence at minimum, Kevin said finally. Possibly negligent homicide depending on how many deaths can be connected to delayed care. Pennsylvania has mandatory reporting laws for suspected abuse in care facilities. I'm calling the state health department now. He made the call, described what Frank had witnessed. Used the words immediate danger and pattern of neglect and multiple fatalities. Got transferred 3 times, finally reached someone with authority. They're sending investigators tomorrow morning, Kevin said after hanging up. Unannounced visit, full inspection. They'll interview residents and staff, review all medical records and death certificates. Frank, you'll need to give formal testimony. I'll tell them everything I've seen. Tommy gripped Frank's shoulder, the way partners did after tough calls. You always were the one who gave a damn, even when it wasn't easy. The next morning, Wednesday at 9:15 a.m., 3 state health department investigators arrived with emergency inspection authority. They interviewed Frank first. He'd requested that specifically, wanted to get his account on record before anyone could interfere. He gave them everything: names, dates, specific incidents, the conversation he'd overheard about delaying his emergency response. He explained his background: 34 years as firefighter and paramedic, trained to recognize medical emergencies, qualified to assess whether responses were appropriate. You're saying the facility systematically delays emergency medical responses to reduce costs? The lead investigator, Maria Santos, asked for clarification. Yes, ma'am, I've witnessed it multiple times. They have an explicit policy. Heard an administrator telling a nurse to wait 30 minutes before calling 911 for a resident with dropping blood pressure because they were over budget on ambulance costs. Did you report this when it happened? I tried. Called my son, who placed me here and works in healthcare administration. He defended the facility's practices and threatened to have me declared incompetent if I continued raising concerns. Maria's expression hardened. Your son works in healthcare administration? Memorial Hospital, 40 minutes from here. The administrator mentioned him specifically when discussing why they didn't want to send patients there. We'll need to investigate that connection. She made notes. Mr. Sullivan, what you're describing is criminal conduct. We're going to need extensive documentation. Over the next 8 hours, investigators interviewed staff, reviewed files, examined medication logs and death certificates and incident reports. They found the patterns Frank had observed: systematic delays in emergency response, cost-benefit calculations before calling 911, documentation that minimized severity to avoid transfers. They found Mrs. Davis's death certificate, listed as natural causes, no mention of the untreated head injury and subsequent infection. They found Mr. Martinez's cardiac event, delayed intervention, permanent damage. They found 17 other residents who died in the past 18 months, with similar patterns of delayed or inadequate response. They found emails from corporate headquarters to facility management. Reduce ambulance transfers by 40% to meet quarterly. Targets: staff bonuses tied to keeping hospital admission rates below threshold. Implement triage protocols that prioritize facility-based care over costly emergency transfers. It was all documented. Corporate policy, translated into practice, resulting in systematic medical neglect. By Thursday morning, the facility's operating license was suspended. By Friday, the medical director had surrendered his license pending investigation. By Monday, criminal charges were filed against the administrator, the corporate parent company, and 3 staff members. Michael was contacted by investigators. They had found his name in facility documents, referral bonuses, consultation fees, advisory payments. He'd been receiving money for every patient he referred to. Peaceful Valley had been on their corporate advisory board, had financial incentives to keep residents there rather than transferring them to Memorial Hospital. He'd put his father in a facility that paid him the kickbacks, knowing they cut corners on medical care, prioritizing his own financial gain over his father's safety. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office opened a broader investigation. How many other facilities did this corporate chain operate? How many other healthcare administrators received kickbacks? How many other families had been deceived? The investigation expanded to 6 states, 34 facilities, hundreds of cases of delayed response and questionable deaths. Frank testified at the grand jury hearing, then at the trials. His background as a paramedic gave him credibility that couldn't be shaken. His observations were factual, precise, documented with the attention to detail of someone who'd spent 3 decades writing incident reports that had to hold up in court. All defendants were convicted. The facility administrator received 12 years for negligent homicide and elder abuse. Corporate officers received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. Staff members who'd participated received probation and lost their licenses. Michael wasn't charged criminally. The referral payments were technically legal if disclosed, which they weren't. But he lost his job, faced civil lawsuits from families, lost his professional reputation. The hospital terminated his contract. His name became synonymous with elder abuse for profit. Frank didn't attend Michael's civil trial. He'd said everything he needed to say to his son during one phone call after the verdicts. "You forgot what I taught you. You forgot that helping people matters more than money. I hope someday you remember. But I can't have someone in my life who'd put me in danger for profit." Michael had cried, had apologized, had begged for forgiveness. Frank had said, "Maybe someday, but not today," and hung up. After the trials, Frank moved to a different facility, a nonprofit care center run by veterans organizations, properly staffed, properly managed, where medical emergencies were treated as emergencies and ambulances were called without budget concerns. He also became a consultant. State health departments wanted his expertise, how to recognize signs of systematic medical neglect, how to train inspectors on emergency response protocols, how to identify facilities that prioritized costs over care. He gave lectures to medical students about the importance of immediate intervention. He trained nursing home staff on recognizing emergencies. He worked with legislators on laws requiring minimum response standards for care facilities. At 78 years old, Frank Sullivan was still a first responder, just responding to different emergencies now, systemic failures instead of individual crises, but using the same skills, the same unwavering commitment to saving lives. On a morning in late spring, Frank sat in his new room with better light, better air quality, better everything. His oxygen concentrator hummed quietly. His COPD remained. That wasn't going away. But he was receiving proper respiratory care, regular medical follow-up, appropriate emergency response when needed. His daughter Beth visited every week now, driving 3 hours from Pittsburgh. She'd been horrified by Michael's actions, had testified against him in the civil trials, had cut off contact with her brother completely. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she'd said 100 times. "I should have checked on you more, should have known something was wrong." "Not your fault, sweetheart," he'd told her every time. "Michael was good at hiding it, and I handled it." "You always do," she'd said, pride and sadness mixed in her voice. Frank had his old crew visiting regularly now. Tommy and the guys from Ladder 15, retired and active both, bringing coffee and war stories, and the comfortable camaraderie of people who'd run into burning buildings together. He had new friends here too, other residents who appreciated his watchfulness, his willingness to speak up, his absolute refusal to tolerate neglect or abuse. He'd become an unofficial advocate, someone residents came to when they had concerns, someone staff treated with genuine respect, because they knew he recognized good care from bad and wouldn't hesitate to call out problems. Frank looked at his dress helmet on the dresser. Boston Fire Department, Ladder 15, 34 years. Next to it now sat the letters from families whose relatives had died at Peaceful Valley, thanking him for exposing the truth, for fighting when they couldn't, for being the first responder their loved ones had needed. He thought about Michael sometimes, felt the ache of that broken relationship. You raised a child to be good, to help people, to value life, and somewhere along the way they forgot those lessons, chose money over morals, convenience over compassion. Maybe someday they'd reconcile. Maybe Michael would rediscover the values Frank had tried to teach him. But that was Michael's journey to make. Frank's journey was here, continuing the work he'd always done, just in different form. Saving lives, protecting the vulnerable, running toward danger instead of away from it. He'd been a firefighter for 34 years, had pulled people from burning buildings, had performed CPR on strangers, had risked his life, because that's what first responders did. Some things he'd learned you never really retired from: the instinct to help, the refusal to watch people suffer when you could do something about it, the bone-deep certainty that every life mattered, that cost-benefit analyses didn't apply when human beings needed help. Frank Sullivan was 78 years old, living in a care facility with COPD and limited mobility and all the physical limitations of age, but he was still a first responder in every way that counted. Still watching for emergencies, still ready to act, still willing to run toward the danger, even when the danger was systematic neglect and corporate greed and his own son's betrayal. He adjusted his oxygen cannula, took a slow breath, felt the familiar wheeze in his lungs. He'd saved a lot of lives in 34 years on the job. Turned out he wasn't done yet.